This is Mortgage Morning, and I'm Andy Baker. Here are the housing and mortgage stories shaping the market today. This is Mortgage Morning for Friday, January 2nd, 2026. The lead story, what 2026 could look like for housing. Axios published a 2026 housing outlook that's worth your attention because it pulls together what multiple forecasting shops are converging on. A year that's still constrained, but potentially steadier. The core expectation is that mortgage rates stay elevated but not chaotic. Axios points to rates staying around 6.3% in 2026, with affordability improving only slightly, mostly because wage growth is expected to outpace home price growth. Realtors.com's 2026 national forecast calls for mortgage rates averaging 6.3% and home prices rising 2.2% year over year. They also expect existing home sales to rise modestly to 4.13 million, still historically low but better than the recent trough, and inventory to continue recovering. Redfin's 2026 outlook is a bit more conservative on prices. It forecasts the 30-year fixed rate averaging 6.3% as well, but expects the median home sale price to rise 1% year over year, specifically making the argument that the next phase looks like a long, slow normalization where income growth finally runs ahead of price growth for a while. Axios is essentially stitching those threads together into a simple message. 2026 may bring more stability than relief. Two implications for brokers and loan officers. First, if rates hang in the low to mid-sixes, we're not going to have a refi revival. It's a purchase market with selective refinance opportunities and more borrowers taking time to decide because the payment shock remains real. Second, the outlook is increasingly regional. Axios highlights a shift that a lot of you feel already. Strength has been showing up more in parts of the Northeast and Midwest than in some of the Southern and Western markets that ran hot earlier in the cycle. The reason given is familiar. Tight inventory and relatively solid labor markets in those regions are keeping price pressure firmer than people expected. As always, the national average is less useful than the local story, and 2026 looks like a year where that gap widens, not narrows. Builders and supply. A K-shaped market shows up in construction. The Washington Post had a strong recap on builders after many expected a more meaningful rebound. Single-family construction starts were projected to end 2025 down about 7% compared with 2024, with additional pressure coming from higher financing costs, material uncertainty, and labor availability. But the more useful story is what's happening underneath that average. Luxury and higher-end resilience. Even with higher rates, there are parts of the market still moving, especially where buyers have equity, cash, or high income stability. The Post points to relative resilience in custom and higher-end work, along with segments like townhomes that can fit affordability constraints better than standalone single-family in some markets. That's the K-shaped economy in housing. One cohort is rate-sensitive and constrained, another cohort is simply less constrained. Regional divergence, where it's weaker and where it's holding up. To make this specific, here's what recent regional construction data has been showing. The South has been softer on a year-to-date basis in recent census and AHB tracking, important because the South has the largest share of U.S. housing production. Even a modest slowdown there pulls down national totals. The West has been closer to flat overall in recent regional tracking, but with meaningful pockets of weakness where permitting economics don't work. The Northeast and Midwest have shown comparatively stronger year-to-date growth in combined starts in recent regional summaries, smaller base but firmer momentum. And here's a real-world example of the pocket of weakness problem. In the Bay Area, the San Jose region has been identified as a major driver of a permit slump, with a sharp decline in multifamily permits and developers citing the usual mix of costs, uncertainty, and friction in the process. So the national starts down 7% figure is helpful as a headline, but what matters operationally is this: builders are being selective. When costs and financing are tight, they don't spread risk evenly. They pull back hard in the weakest submarkets and they keep building where demand is durable and pricing still clears. If you're trying to anticipate purchase pipelines for the spring and summer, that's the lens, where builders are still willing to take risk and where they're not. Policy Watch. HUD raises the 2026 reverse mortgage cap. One HUD update that quietly took effect January 1st is an increase in the FHA's nationwide maximum claim amount for home equity conversion mortgages, or HECMs. For 2026, the cap rises to $1,249,125, up from $1,209,750 in 2025, and applies to FHA case numbers assigned on or after January 1st. On paper, a roughly $40,000 increase doesn't sound dramatic. In practice, it can meaningfully expand options for a narrow but important slice of borrowers. Here's why. Reverse mortgages don't let borrowers tap their full home value. The amount they can access is constrained by three things: their age, prevailing interest rates, and the maximum claim amount. When the cap rises, borrowers with higher value homes, especially in expensive markets, can access a larger portion of their equity through the FHA program instead of needing proprietary products or layered solutions. That matters most in places where home prices have stayed elevated even as transactions slowed. A senior homeowner with a $1.3 million home, for example, was previously capped well below the property's value. The higher limit doesn't suddenly unlock everything, but it can mean tens of thousands of additional dollars in available proceeds, depending on age and rates. Practically, that extra capacity can be the difference between paying off an existing forward mortgage entirely instead of partially, covering long-term care or medical costs without selling the home, or consolidating higher-cost debt rather than carrying it into retirement. It also reduces pressure to move borrowers into non-FHA proprietary reverse products, which can carry different pricing, protections, and investor dynamics. For lenders and brokers who work in reverse at all, this update is less about volume growth and more about flexibility. It widens the lane slightly in higher-cost markets and gives originators more room to structure solutions that stay within the FHA framework rather than pushing borrowers outside of it. In a market where affordability solutions for seniors are limited and where home equity is often their largest asset, that extra $40K doesn't change everything, but for the borrowers it applies to, it can change enough to matter. And that's it for Mortgage Morning. If you found this episode useful, follow the show, share it with someone in the biz. I'm Andy Baker. Thanks for listening.